This is how I'd like to begin our lecture today. I'd like for you to imagine that when you entered class today, you encountered a sign that read, African American Studies students must sit in this section only, and it pointed to a limited area of the classroom. A section at the back of the room with only just enough seats available for all the class members present today. And then to extend the thought exercise, imagine that there was a police officer in the room who made you sit up straight, required you to keep all your books and bags and laptops under your desks, and periodically interrupted my lecture to bark out orders correcting your conduct. What if you had to pay attention and work under those conditions? How effective would you be? How angry and frustrated would you get? Well, I wasn't able to get a police officer to come into class today to do that, so we'll have to keep that part of the thought experiment in our imagination. But you will find that this lecture will be occasionally interrupted by a virtual member of the police force, requiring you to do those very things. The connection with the topic of my lecture will soon become evident. So, here we are, week 7. The topic is the Great Migration from 1916 to 1945, and I've titled this lecture, Pushed, Pulled, and Politicized. Let's start with an overview. 1,007,500 African Americans left the South between 1910 and 1940. That was a doubling of the black population outside the South. A majority of those who relocated were comparatively younger, born post-slavery in the 1880s and 1890s. So there were two forces at play. The first were those forces that pushed African Americans out of the South to the North and the West. There are a variety of those forces that pushed black folk from rural areas. First of all, we'll mention the floods in Alabama and Mississippi in 1915 that destroyed both crops and family homes. Then we'll talk about the destruction of cotton crops all the way from Mexico to the Carolinas from the boll weevil. Now, some did find ways to beat this little worm that destroyed cotton crops, but the larger picture was that the destruction of the crops undermined the jobs available for the African American community in the South. And then there was ongoing violence from the newly birthed KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, on October 16, 1915 in Stone Mountain outside Atlanta, Georgia. Remember, this is the second KKK, the first having been put in place after the end of the Civil War. There was also the process of lynching. From 1882 through to 1914, 2,201 African Americans had been lynched in the South. From 1882 through 1914, 2,201. Now this is compared to 1,1216 whites who had been also lynched, although those numbers were greatly reduced in the last portion of the period I've just discussed. It would take until 1936 for lynchings to drop to single digits within the African American community, although that had already happened within the white community in the first decade of the 20th century. So in addition to this ongoing violence and the boll weevil and the floods and the lynching, there also was the ongoing practice of sexual exploitation by white men of black women and by black men of black women. Rape, in particular, was an ongoing problem that black women faced in the South. Less seriously, there was also the lack of entertainment or organized opportunities for pastimes in many of the rural locations where the African American population was then situated. And in an ongoing effort to disenfranchise African Americans, white Southern Democrats in particular had instituted poll taxes, balloting schemes, literacy requirements, and gerrymandering, the creation of special voting districts to be sure that there were no black majorities, a practice that continues in our contemporary setting. There also was the reality of police brutality, which was a function of pushing people out. There was a lack of consistent education, also played an important role where African American children couldn't get the same access to public education as could white children. And then there was a tightening of credit, where loans were not being made available to black farmers in the same ways they were being made available to white farmers. All of these factors combined together to push African Americans out of the South to the North and to the West. And I'm telling you, I'm tired of seeing all those bags in the aisles. I want those bags shoved under your desk so the aisles are clear in case of an emergency. Up here in the North, we don't handle that kind of stuff. We don't want to see any aisles being messed up. We want those aisles straight and orderly and respectable. Get the bags under the desk. I'm talking to you. Yeah, you with the glasses. Get that bag under your desk now. There was also a process of pulling African Americans to the North, not just pushing them out of the South, but pulling them to the North. These were the variety of forces that attracted African Americans to the North and to the West. They included, for example, a labor shortage in manufacturing and industry in the North created by World War I. You had an increase in the need for manufacturing and industry, but you didn't have people to fill those jobs. African Americans from the South could do so. There was also a drastic reduction in European immigration that had previously been a source of inexpensive labor in the North. But with the onset of World War I, the immigration had been cut off from Europe, and so the new Europeans were not arriving to take those jobs. African Americans were attracted to come and fill them. There were large orders being placed for war materiel, and people needed to fill the jobs to fulfill those orders. There were new jobs also opening up in railroads, meat packing plants, and automobile industry. All of this created the labor shortage to which African Americans came to fill. The possibility of voting in the North was also critical. It simply was no longer feasible for large percentages of African Americans in the South to be able to vote and have their vote counted. That was possible in the North. Also, there was the possibility of improved education and better schools for African American children. Children also would be freed from the requirements of engaging in agricultural labor, thereby resulting in a longer school year for the children to partake in that available public education. And entertainment was much more widely available, other organized opportunities for leisure activities, and just a general interest in what was referred to as bettering my condition. All these forces combined to pull African Americans from the South to the North. Now, what did that pulling process look like? Well, there was a process of recruitment in which employers and others in the North tried to attract African Americans to relocate. There were some recruiters that were sent by Northern industry to try to get people to come and fill those jobs. And then black newspapers like the Chicago Defender also promoted relocation. Copies of the paper were distributed widely throughout the South via black porters and workers on dining cars who would travel to the South and return. Readers in the South viewed the Defender as an active opponent of white Southern racism. They saw within that paper an advocate for their condition. And often the paper would play up a contrast between the relative freedom in the North versus the overt oppression in the South, with the trade-off of significantly colder weather in the North that people would have to face. One letter in the Defender wrote, "To die from the bite of frost is far more glorious than that of the mob. I beg of you, my brothers, to leave that benighted land," that is the South. "You are free men." All right, I'm Officer James, and I want to see some people sitting up straight in your desks right now. None of this slouching going on. I want you to be upright, in place, and paying attention with your back straight as a rod. Pay attention. Now, there were lots of kin connections between the North and the South. For example, black preachers would come from the South, visit Northern churches, speak there, and then relate their impressions to their congregations back at home when they returned to the South. Those connections and self help also took the form of migration clubs. These were organizations of people who banded together to share information about how to migrate, about how to assist each other in making that move possible. And they would look for ways to support each other in that uncertainty of a dislocation. It's yet another further example of the self-help tradition and of the intensive organization within the black community that made the Great Migration possible. But there was some opposition within the black community to the process of migration, most notably in the well-known figure of Booker T. Washington. Ever since his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, Booker T. Washington had been opposing northern migration. He promoted putting down your bucket where you are, that is, working in your local environment to earn the respect of the white community. Now, northern migration also undermined and threatened Washington's influence because it would end up meaning fewer African Americans to benefit from his leadership and more who would come in contact with the northern philanthropists who supported his Tuskegee machine. But his death in 1915 undermined this source of opposition. Now, how did white folk in the South respond to the prospect and reality of African Americans moving away from rural communities? Well, in general, they were somewhat ambivalent. On the one hand, they were not disappointed by the disappearance of a group for whom they had little regard. On the other, they were concerned that they were losing a source of inexpensive labor. When recruitment agents from the North would show up, white businessmen would sometimes force them to leave without a second thought. Now, this process of displacement that I've just described was really a multi-phased process. The movement to the north took place in steps. Many immigrants did not just move from one rural southern location to one urban northern location. They often moved several times. Sometimes they would move first to a southern urban location that also saw significant increases during the Great Migration. And from that southern urban location, they would then move to one northern urban location and then perhaps to another. For example, a South Carolina Sea Islander moved from his home in 1917 to seek out better wages. First, he moved from a rural location in South Carolina to Savannah, Georgia. Then from Savannah, Georgia, he moved to Philadelphia and finally more permanently to Baltimore. Langston Hughes, the poet of the Harlem Renaissance, his parents moved from a rural location in Missouri, the small town of Joplin, Missouri, then to Lincoln, Illinois, and from there to Cleveland, Ohio. Again, an example of that multi-phased moving process. Now, there were varying degrees of planning involved. Some planned deliberately for years, saved up their funds, arranged for jobs in advance of their arrival, which was no small feat before the days of phones, websites, and in many cases, publicly available landlines. This process would mean leaving behind family and friends, finding a new place to live, a new job, leaving behind all important social networks. Having to learn how to live in a city environment with its greater concentration of humanity, more stresses, faster pace, uncertainty about how to proceed in an unfamiliar place, all of these required tremendous resilience on the part of those who moved. That's on the one hand, those who planned ahead. Others moved more spontaneously. For example, Jane Edna Hunter lost her job as a nurse at the Hampton Institute in Virginia in 1905. She decided at first to relocate to Florida, but stopped in to visit family friends on the way in Richmond, Virginia. When she met them on the front steps of their home, they promptly informed her, "Our bags are packed to go to Cleveland, Jane. We are going to take you with us." So she simply rechecked her luggage and moved north, swept up by her friends' determination and enthusiasm. Now, those who migrated left, but they also didn't leave. Despite having physically relocated to the north, Black Southerners who relocated maintained many connections with family and friends in their home communities. They not only corresponded, but returned home for holidays, weddings, funerals, and other special events. They also sent money amounting to millions of dollars over the years that transferred wealth from the north back to the south. Now, how did the folks leave? How did they move? Well, there were very specific relocation patterns that they pursued. Where people ended up was largely determined by where they started. Migrants from the Carolinas and Virginia tended to settle in D.C., Philly, and New York. Those from Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi tended to settle in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. Those from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas took the Illinois Central Railroad to Chicago. Secondary relocation often then took place from a large metropolis to smaller cities, like from Philadelphia in Pennsylvania to the smaller city of Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, or to Altoona or Wilmington, Delaware. I've mentioned already Western migration. Generally, that did not take place until the 1930s and 1940s. At that point, many moved to California, Oregon, and Washington, some to Montana, but a few did relocate subsequently. Take, for example, Mally Robinson, who moved from Cairo, Georgia, to Los Angeles and then to Pasadena. Her husband had left her, so she, her 5 children, and 8 relatives took the train across the country, having been told by Mally's half-brother that California was more like heaven than Georgia. Mally's 1-year-old son, Jackie, would emerge from the West to break the color line in baseball. Mally Robinson was mother to Jackie Robinson. "Officer James back again. All right, this time I want to see those feet under the desk where they should be, with no feet in the aisles in any way, because that's not appropriate conduct up here in the north. Get those feet under the desk." Yeah, I'm talking to you, the ones with those winter boots on. Come on, get your feet under the desk. So what was the situation in the destination communities to which African Americans arrived? Cities like Chicago and Harlem had their own histories into which African American migrants entered. In Chicago, the Black community had a long tradition of leaders and institutions. The first Black policeman was stationed there in 1872. There was a Black senator to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1876, a man by the name of John W.E. Thomas. The first Black hospital in Chicago was founded in 1891, Provident Hospital. Now, the surge of immigrants affected the Black community that had been there for decades. By 1920, there were 80 Baptist and 36 Methodist churches. A 9,000-member congregation at Olivet Baptist Church by 1922. up from 3,500 in 1916. The first black bank opened up in 1908, Jesse Binga State Bank. The Liberty Insurance Company was formed by Frank Gillespie in 1919, again, a historically black institution. And Illinois sent its first black congressman to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first since Reconstruction, in 1928, Oscar DePriest. Now, whether in the West or in the North, African Americans seldom found that Edenic community that they had sought. They settled in concentrated communities of African Americans, whether in Harlem, the south side of Chicago, an 8-square-mile section, Detroit's Paradise Valley, or the Hill District of Pittsburgh, not to mention the east side of Cleveland. Now, these forces of concentration were not accidental. In Chicago, the black community had risen in size from 44,000 in 1910 to more than 109,000 in 1920. They threatened to spill out of the boundaries of the black communities into which they had been forced. Now, African Americans were attracted not only to be with people that they felt comfortable being around, other black folk, but also because whites refused to rent or sell outside those concentrated communities. And as concentration of humanity increased in those settings, so did crime and vice. In short, as James Grossman points out, African American migrants were more pluralist than they were integrationist. That is, they were more interested in developing their own institutions alongside white institutions than in integrating existing white institutions. They were quite comfortable to have their own communities existing alongside white communities, a pluralist rather than an integrationist interest. Officer James, right back at you, and I'm telling you, this time I've seen enough expressions of boredom in this room to sink a ship. I want to see those expressions looking interested and focused and able to pay attention to what this man is saying here right now. You need to get these things together, get your faces looking more expressively interested than they had been before. Okay, enough of that. Enough interruptions for the day. That was starting to get annoying. But you get the connection. The experience of the African American community who migrated that migrated to the north and west was one of interruption. The interruption of leaving home, usually a place where one was known, loved, and connected to a web of family. The interruption of life and space, having to find a new place to live, to work, to play, and to build community. The interruption of enforcement, not only by the police, although that was an all too common and often violent experience, but also the interruption of those who controlled the banks, party membership, job access, schools, churches, realty, and rental practices, who interrupted the African American community's lives by controlling access to any of those institutions. And so, for worse and for better, the Great Migration was an interruption. To conclude, let's talk briefly about some of the connections between the lecture that I just gave and the readings that are assigned for this week. Here are a few things to pay attention to. Note, for example, the focus on Pittsburgh in the Gottlieb article. In that article, Gottlieb notes the circulation common between North and South due to unstable employment in industry, due to family obligations, etc. A move to the North was often not just a move to the North, it was a move to the North and a return to the South, and a move to the North and a return to the South. The understanding that the housing conditions in Pittsburgh, as well as lending practices and access to real estate, were worse there than in some cases other locations in the South. It was not always a process of moving to a new Eden. Upon arrival in Pittsburgh, Gottlieb also notes the heightened tensions between established African American Pittsburgh residents and the new black arrivals, labeled Geechees. Some black churches in Pittsburgh did help the new immigrants, but also with condescending attitudes. And finally, Gottlieb notes the collapse of industries following World War I, where people had to leave. They returned when jobs started up again several years later in Firestone rubber factories, mills, and ironworks, but again, it was often a circulatory process. And I'll also just add a few comments emerging from the Watkins-Owens article, again, nuancing our understanding of the Great Migrations. Watkins-Owens notes that there were a large influx of immigrants from the Caribbean who relocated to Harlem between 1900 and 1930, another kind of migration than that which I've talked about today. Noting that Harlem was opened up by a central subway line in 1904 that allowed it to become an area in which people could live but then work elsewhere. The author also notes new stresses on racial identity that emerge in the process of this particular strand of migration. How would immigrants of African descent be perceived by the white public and within the African American community? Watkins-Owens also recognized that speaking Spanish changed the rules of segregation forever. If you were seen as a Spanish speaker, you were given far more latitude than if you were perceived, because you were being perceived as a foreigner. The author also emphasizes again the importance of kinship networks and social organizations that helped establish and welcome newcomers from the same area. For example, Sons and Daughters of Virginia in New York City welcomed people from Virginia to the Big Apple. But those same associations could also be clannish and exclusive. For example, the author there notes the Bermuda Benevolent Association, which welcomed some and excluded others. They also trace attempts by black folk to connect with existing orders like the Masons and Elks, and also notes how critical churches, benevolent associations, lodges, and fraternal orders were for bringing immigrants from the Caribbean and the South into the black community in New York City. So these articles help give us a more detailed picture of the larger trends that I discussed earlier on.